In this lesson, we're going to be talking about the safety data sheets. Now, this presentation does come from OSHA, so I do need to give them credit here for doing a great presentation. The revised Hazard Communication Standard, HazCom 2012, requires that the information on the safety data sheets, formerly the material data safety sheets, has to be presented using specific headings in a specific sequence. The format of the 16-section safety data sheet should include the following sections. Section 1 is identification. Section 2 is hazard identification. Section 3 is composition information on ingredients. Section 4 is first aid. Section 5 is firefighting. Section 6 is accidental release measures. Section 7 is handling and storage. Section 8 is exposure controls and personal protection. Section 9 is physical and chemical properties. Section 10, stability and reactivity. Section 11 is toxicological information. Section 12 is ecological information. Section 13 is disposal considerations. Section 14 is transport information. Section 15 is regulatory information. Section 16 is additional other information, including the date of preparation or the last revision. The SDS must also contain sections 12 through 15 to be consistent with United Nations globally harmonized system of classification and labeling of chemicals, known as GHS. Although the sections headings for sections 12 through 15 are mandatory, OSHA will not enforce the content of these 4 sections because the sections are within other agencies' jurisdictions. So what is the safety data sheet? The SDS is a prime source of information on health hazards. An example of the first page of such a sheet containing sections 1 and 2 are on the right of your screen. Material safety data sheets are required to be in English. They are located in areas where materials are being used and generated, and they must be readily acceptable to all employees during work shift. In other words, they have to have in binders or free electronic access using tools that are available. In other words, a company can't say that it's electronically accessible if there's no computers available for people to use them. They have to be readily accessible. SDS 1, it's an indication of the substance or mixture of the supplier. Okay, GSH, product identification, other means of identification, recommended use of the chemical and restrictions on use. Supplier details, including name, address, phone number, and it has to have an emergency phone number where 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, there's someone to reach regarding health hazards and treatment of this chemical. Section 2 is a hazard identification, a GHS classification of the substance, the mixture, and any national or regional information. Also has to include label elements, including precautionary statement. Hazard symbols may be provided as a graphical reproduction of the symbols in black and white, or the name and symbol of flames, skull and crossbones, etc. Other hazards which do not result in classification, like dust explosion hazards, are not covered by the GHS. Section 3 is the composition or information on the ingredients. What is in the substance? The chemical identity, common names, synonyms, etc. A CAS number or other unique identifiers. Impurities, stabilizing additives, which themselves are classified, which contribute to the classification of the substances. The mixture, which is the chemical identity and concentration or concentration of the range of all ingredients, meaning of the GHS and are present above their cutoff levels. For information on ingredients, the competent authority rules for CBI take priority over the rules for product identification. Section 4 is extremely important for the worker. Its first aid measures, description of the necessary measures subdivided according to the different routes of exposure. For example, inhalation, skin and eye contact, or indigestion. The most important symptoms or effects, acute and delayed. The indication of immediate medical attention and the special treatment if needed. Section 5 is the firefighting measures. What are the suitable and unsuitable extinguishing media? What class of fire extinguishers do you use? Specific hazards arising from the chemical, like the nature of any hazardous combustion products. Special protective equipment and precaution needed for firefighters are included in this section. Section 6 of the SDS includes accidental release measures. What personal precautions need to be followed? What protective equipment and emergency procedures are required? What are the environmental precautions? What are the methods and materials for containment and cleanup? Section 7 describes handling and storage. What are the precautions for safe handling? What conditions for safe storage, including any incompatibilities? Section 8 includes exposure controls and personal protection. What are the control parameters for occupational exposure limit values or biological limit values? What are the appropriate engineering controls? What are the individual protection measures, such as personal protective equipment, that are required? Section 9 is the physical and chemical properties. How does it appear? What are the odors? What are the odor thresholds? What's the pH? What's the melting point, the freezing point? What are the initial boiling points in the boiling range? What is the flash point? In other words, when will it explode? What's the evaporation rate? What's the flammability rating, solid or gas? This is in section 9. What are the upper and lower flammability exposure limits? What's the vapor pressure? What's the vapor density? What's the relative density? What's the solubility? What's the portion coefficient, noctile or water? What's the auto-ignition temperature? What's the decomposition temperature? And what's the viscosity? This again is all part of section 9. What does it look like? What are the physical properties? Section 10 deals with stability and reactivity. What's the reactivity of the chemical? What's the stability? What's the possibility of hazardous reactions? What conditions are you going to avoid? Static discharge, static shock, or vibration? What are incompatible materials? In other words, what should not be stored with it? What's the hazardous decomposition products? In other words, as the chemical decomposes, if it's a mixture, what's it going to break apart as? 11 is toxicology information. It has to be concise but complete and a comprehensible description of the various toxicological health effects and the available data used to identify these. It has to include information on the likely routes of exposure, inhalation, indigestion, skin, and eye contact. It has to have symptoms related to the physical, chemical, and toxicological characteristics. What are the delayed and immediate effects, and also the chronic effects from short and long-term exposure? Numerical measures of toxicity, such as acute toxicity estimates. What's it going to do if you get it into your body? Section 12 is ecological information. Okay, ecotoxicity, aquatic, terrestrial, where available. Persistence and degradability, what's its half-lives? What's it going to do? Bioaccumulative potential. Mobility in soil and other adverse effects. How's it going to affect our environment if a spill happens, or even during the regular standards of use? Section 13 talks about disposal. It has a description of the waste residues and information on their safe handling and methods of disposal. including the disposal of any contaminated packaging. This tells you how to get rid of it once you've used it. Section 14 is all about transportation. What is the UN number? What is the UN proper shipping names? What's the transport hazard classes? What's the packing group? What can it be packed with? What are the environmental hazards while shipping? Is it a marine pollutant? Transport in bulk. Can it be? What are the special precautions a user needs to be aware of or needs to comply with in connection with the transport or conveyance, either within or outside their premises? And down at the bottom of this slide, you see the standard tags that you see for hazardous material transportation. This is extremely important because a transporter, like a trucker, needs to know what placards needs to be used on the outside of their vehicles. Section 15 is the regulatory information. It includes the safety, health, and environmental regulations specific for the product in question. What are the regulatory effects? Different regulatory effects have to be listed for different states or countries that it will be in. Section 16 includes other information, including information on the preparation and revision of the SDS. Okay, when was it revised? When is it next going to be revised? Any disclaimers would go in section 16. Now, several of these chemicals sometimes include trade secrets. So OSHA 1910.1200 includes a section on trade secrets. It says where a treating physician or nurse determines that a medical emergency exists and a specific chemical identity of a hazardous chemical is necessary for first aid or treatment, the chemical manufacturer, importer, or employer shall immediately disclose the chemical identity of a trade secret chemical to that treating physician or nurse, regardless of the existence of a written statement of need or confidentiality agreement. The chemical manufacturer, importer, or employer may require a written statement of need and confidentiality agreement in accordance with this provision of this section as soon as the circumstances permit. In other words, the person who knows the chemical identity and the chemical composition of what's considered a trade sequence has to disclose it in the case of emergency, regardless of having a statement of confidentiality. However, once the emergency is over, the employer may require a statement of confidentiality. Risk assessment is the degree of its capacity to harm depends on the intrinsic properties, its capacity to interfere with normal biological process, its capacity to burn, explode, corrode, etc. The basic approach to risk assessment is characterized by the simple formula: hazard multiplied by exposure equals risk. Thus, if you can minimize either the hazard or exposure, you minimize the risk or likelihood of harm. Successful hazard communication alerts the user to the presence of a hazard and the need to minimize the exposure and the resulting risk. Industrial hygiene is the anticipation, recognition, and evaluation and control of occupational hazard. So risk equals the likelihood and severity. Exposure is the contact with a chemical, physical, radiological, or biological agent. Assessment means the process of gathering, analyzing, and documenting an evaluation. Industrial hygiene assessment includes the type of hazard, the toxicity, the quantity and use, the duration of use, past monitoring data, and establishing occupational exposure models. Concentrations for gases and vapors are measured in parts per million, parts per contaminant per million parts of air by volume. Particulates are measured milligrams of containment per cubic meter of air, and asbestos is measured fiber per cubic centimeter of air. So that's all how concentrations are measured. The recognition of health hazards is important. Clues that may indicate exposure to chemical hazards are odor, taste, particulates in respiratory system, acute symptoms, visible materials in air, or settled dust. We've referred to a permissible exposure limit. That means that's the PEL, which is OSHA's legally allowed concentrations in the workplace. There's 3 types. There's an 8-hour PEL, there's a ceiling PEL, and there's a systemic PEL. OSHA is retaining the requirement to include American Conference of Industrial Hygienists threshold limits on the safety data sheets in the revised standard. OSHA finds that requiring TLVs on the SDS will provide employers and employees with useful information to help them assess the hazards presented by their workplace. In addition to TLVs, OSHA permissible exposure limits, PELs, and any other exposure limit used or recommended by the chemical manufacturer, importer, or employer preparing the safety data sheets are also required. TLV are threshold limit values. They're the airborne concentration of a substance to which it is believed that nearly all workers may be repeatedly exposed day after day without adverse effect. The guidelines are published annually by the Association of Industrial Hygienists. So there's some approximate equivalence between classification schemes. This is a neat chart to take a look back at. Okay, it will tell you what one is equal to another.